For centuries, ball lightning has been the main source of foolishness for village witches and street fortune tellers. Common folk are terrified of the unknown, so they readily invent hovering spirits or the tricks of aliens. But real physics has long since hammered the final nail into the coffin of this mysticism. After all, the truth turned out to be much dirtier, in the truest sense of the word. In July 2012, on the desolate Qinghai Plateau in China, 3 local physicists were setting up spectrographs. Ping Yuan, Jian Yongxin, and Simin Shui simply wanted to record ordinary lightning discharges, but nature decided to surprise them. An ordinary cloud-to-ground impact suddenly generated a glowing sphere about 5 meters wide. This wild, fiery bubble appeared directly in front of their instruments, some 900 meters away. The sphere drifted lazily horizontally at a speed of over 8 meters per second. It flew about 10 meters parallel to the ground, rose 3 meters, and vanished without a trace. This entire performance lasted a measly 1.64 seconds. But this instant was enough for the physicists to, for the first time in history, point their spectrometers at an object and record its precise chemical signature. The analysis results immediately dispelled all the ufologists' myths. There was no exotic energy or traces of aliens within the glowing sphere. The instruments detected mundane silicon, iron, and calcium. The scientists peered beneath their feet and realized that the sphere's spectrum perfectly matched the composition of the local mud. Thus, physics confirmed an old theory by chemist John Abrahamson. When lightning strikes the ground, carbon from the soil absorbs oxygen from the sand. The intense heat vaporizes pure silicon. The energy of the explosion ejects a cloud of nanoparticles into the air. The silicon rapidly burns in the atmosphere. That's the whole miracle. Ordinary, hot dust, glowing from oxidation. Later, Brazilian physicists easily repeated this trick in the laboratory, passing an electric current of up to 140 amperes through silicon wafers and obtaining stable, glowing spheres. And the faint flickering of Chinese lightning at a frequency of 100 Hz was explained by the banal proximity of high-voltage power lines. Earthly science once again defeated cheap mysticism with the help of ordinary manure and the laws of chemistry. The decentralized optimization of the yellow slime mold, Physarum polycephalum, vividly demonstrates the insignificance of the human mind, with all its vaunted billions of neurons. We lose miserably to this yellow goo. People spend decades studying at prestigious universities to earn engineering degrees. We draw complex diagrams on computers and debate them in stuffy meetings. And in the end, we succumb to a common forest mold. This single-celled organism lives in damp forests under rotting leaves, silently mocking our vaunted technologies. It lacks even a hint of a nervous system. In 2010, Japanese biologist Toshiyuki Nakagaki of Hokkaido University decided to test the limits of this mindless mess's logistical stupidity. He conducted an experiment that made transport ministries around the world blush. The scientist took an ordinary damp mat and spread oatmeal, the slime mold's favorite food, on it. But he didn't just spread it out. He meticulously mapped the geographic location of Tokyo and 36 surrounding cities. Nakagaki planted a drop of slime in the very center of this homemade Japanese map. Any human planning committee would have immediately become bogged down in calculations, budget cuts, and endless approvals. The slime mold acted faster and more brutally. At first, the plasmodium simply spread in all directions in a smooth blanket. It probed every centimeter of space in search of food. But then, a brilliant survival algorithm kicked in. The organism began optimizing its shape. It removed excess mass from areas where there were no flakes. The slime mold simply dried out the unnecessary appendages, leaving only the strongest, thickest, and shortest channels for transporting nutrients between points. A few days later, the scientists were stunned. The resulting network of yellow tubes almost perfectly replicated the real-life Tokyo railway system, that legendary 102-line transportation system that carries 14 billion passengers a year. Humans had spent decades designing and building this infrastructure, taking into account the complex terrain and the enormous financial costs. The mindless slime had completed the task in just a couple of days. The secret of this biological miracle lies in primitive hydrodynamics. Fluid circulates continuously within the slime mold. Where the flow is strongest, the walls of the tubes expand. Weaker channels gradually shrink. This simple delay in the wall's response to pressure acts as the body's brain and physical memory. Japanese mathematicians quickly translated these natural algorithms into formulas for creating self-organizing wireless networks and communication systems. Nakagaki received 2 Ig Nobel Prizes for his experiments with slime mold. He clearly demonstrated that solving the most complex logistical problems doesn't require any brains at all. The transoceanic migration of the European eel forces paleontologists and oceanographers to admit their impotence, as long as the general public continues to believe in the intelligent design of nature. These slippery fish live in the quiet rivers of Europe, but in the pursuit of reproduction, they suddenly go mad and embark on a deadly journey of over 5,000 kilometers. They swim across the abyss of the Atlantic Ocean to the Sargasso Sea, only to lay their eggs in the wild depths and immediately die. The idea seems idiotic, but evolution doesn't care about human logic. Along the way, they overcome any obstacles. If land gets in their way, they simply crawl out at night onto the damp grass and slither like a snake. They stubbornly climb even the sheer concrete walls of giant dams, defying gravity. Biologists have been trying unsuccessfully to solve this puzzle for centuries. Back in the 1920s, the Danish scientist Johannes Schmidt secured a grant from the Carlsberg Beer Fund, equipped a vessel named the Dana, and set out to strain the ocean with a fine mesh net. He was looking for tiny, transparent eel larvae. Moving toward where the larvae became increasingly smaller, he eventually sailed to the Sargasso Sea. But when Schmidt attempted to publish his work, the scientific community contemptuously laughed in his face. His paper was rejected, claiming that the Italian scientist Grassi's theory on eel reproduction in the Mediterranean was sufficient. This shameful failure of the peer review system delayed recognition of the obvious fact for years, until the Royal Society finally acknowledged his error and awarded the Dane the Darwin Medal in 1930. But even after this, scientists couldn't catch a single adult eel at their spawning grounds. The fish simply vanished into the ocean like ghosts. It wasn't until 2022 that an international team of researchers published a sensational article in Scientific Reports. Rather than catch the migrating fish in Europe, they decided to intercept them en route near the Azores. The biologists caught 26 large female eels and attached satellite tags to them. These sophisticated sensors measured the depth and temperature of the water every 2 minutes. As soon as the tag detached and floated to the surface, it immediately sent the accumulated data to a satellite. The resulting files shocked biologists. It turned out that eels move through the water at a snail's pace, covering a measly 3 to 12 kilometers per day. At this snail's pace, their fatal swim drags on for 18 months, or even longer. But the funniest thing is that even with the latest technology, humanity is still hugging air. No one, not a single person in the world, has ever seen a live adult eel in the Sargasso Sea itself. We send probes to Mars, build hadron colliders, but a common, slimy fish manages to copulate and die at a depth of millions of tons of salt water, completely unnoticed by our cameras. Nature has once again wiped our arrogance to shame. Spontaneous human combustion has for centuries been a source of panic among fools incapable of understanding the basic laws of physics. Folks love tales of people suddenly turning to ashes without an external flame source. But science has long since explained this terrifying phenomenon. The truth turns out to be far more prosaic and cynical than mystical ravings. In July 1951, in Florida, landlady Pansy Carpenter approached the door of her neighbor, Mary Reeser, with a telegram. But when she touched the doorknob, she jerked her hand away in fear. The metal was scalding hot. Arriving firefighters found a pile of ashes where the chair had been. All that remained of the 67-year-old woman, weighing approximately 77 kilograms, was her left foot in a slipper, a piece of her spine, and her skull. The rest of the room, however, was virtually undamaged. The newspapers on the table remained intact, the bedding was undamaged, and the plastic items in the bathroom hadn't even melted. The clock on the wall was frozen at 4:20. The local police chief panicked and sent the remains to the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, demanding an explanation for the miracle. Experts quickly dispelled the mystery. They demonstrated the human candle effect. Mary Reeser took a sleeping pill and fell asleep in a chair with a lit cigarette. The cigarette butt fell onto her synthetic nightgown. The fabric began to slowly smolder. The high temperature melted the subcutaneous fat. It soaked into the clothes and the stuffing of the chair. The body became a giant candle. The clothes acted as a wick, and the melted fat served as fuel. The process continued for about 12 hours. The temperature inside this hellish fire reached enormous levels. The heat rose straight up to the ceiling. That's why the room remained intact. People still believe in the mystical phenomenon of spontaneous combustion, ignoring the laws of thermodynamics. After all, admitting to being a sack of flammable lard is too offensive to the human ego. The evolutionary dominance of the tiny, toothy cyclothon fish in the ocean's twilight zone vividly demonstrates the utter futility of human notions of dominance on this planet. We naively consider ourselves the pinnacle of creation. We build megacities. We write laws. But at depths of 200 to 1,000 meters, an armada swarms, reducing all of humanity to a pitiful statistical error. There reigns perpetual twilight and monstrous pressure. The water literally compresses the bones. Sunlight fades almost completely. 90% of the local inhabitants glow with a cold chemical light, throwing a disco in the pitch darkness. And this hellish circus is ruled by a nondescript, bristly-toothed creature. They're called cyclotons, and their numbers number in the quadrillions. Consider that number. For every bipedal human, there are over 100,000 of these toothy creatures. They live in liquid space and thrive. To survive the perpetual hunger, they've developed ridiculously effective survival mechanisms. Cyclotons begin life as males, and as they mature, with a subtle hormonal shift, they transform into females. No existential crises. Just dry biological calculation. Their underbelly is dotted with glowing dots. This trick is called counter-illumination. When a predator looks up from the abyss, the glow from their belly completely blurs the fish's silhouette against the dim light from above. Perfect invisibility. They've even abandoned the traditional air bladder, replacing it with fat to easily withstand pressure changes. Recently, paleontologists have completely disabused humanity of its uniqueness. While drilling into the ocean floor at an international station in the Southern Ocean, researchers stumbled upon microscopic fossilized teeth with strange spiral serrations. The age of this find is a staggering 55,600,000 years. These teeth belong to the ancient ancestors of modern cyclothons. They thrived during the extreme global warming of the early Eocene. They calmly survived global climate change, ice ages, and the extinction of giants. Our civilization has existed for mere seconds in cosmic time and is already suffocating from industrial smog. And these microscopic fish have silently observed the birth and death of millions of species. Every night, trillions of these creatures rise to the surface in search of plankton, completing the largest daily migration on Earth. And then they return to the abyss before dawn. We may build hadron colliders and imagine ourselves as conquerors of nature, but the true masters of the planet swim silently in the black water, unaware of our foolish existence. Amyloid degeneration of the cerebral cortex in Alzheimer's disease vividly demonstrates the insignificance of the human mind in the face of a simple protein breakdown. The average person is terrified of insanity. They are willing to spend huge sums of money on dubious medications rather than acknowledge the obvious. Our brain is simply a fragile biological computer. This pathology systematically destroys the personality, turning yesterday's genius into a frightened creature with amnesia. And the most cynical thing is that science is still unable to stop this nightmare. In November 1901, Augusta Dieter was brought to a hospital in Frankfurt. She was only 51 years old, but she was already out of control. She was wildly jealous of her husband Carl, hid things, and mixed up her words, stubbornly calling meat spinach. Psychiatrist Alois Alzheimer tormented her with questions for years, but the unfortunate woman would only repeat one phrase: "I've lost myself." 5 years later, Augusta died of blood poisoning due to bed sores, and Alzheimer immediately opened her skull. The patient's brain had shrunk to an obscene size. A normal female brain weighs about 1,200 grams. The disease consumes about 8% of the total mass. The temporal cortex, responsible for memory, shrank by more than 16%. Within the damaged tissue, Alzheimer's found 2 clues. The first was sticky beta-amyloid plaques on the outside of neurons, blocking signals. The second was hidden inside the cells in the form of tangles of tau protein, which disrupt the neuronal transport network. Neurons were deprived of nutrition and died by the millions. But the funniest fact lies in the doctor's reaction. In November 1906, Alzheimer presented this discovery at a psychiatric congress in Tübingen. When he finished his presentation, a deathly silence fell over the room. The audience of 88 doctors didn't ask him a single question. It turned out they were bored to death and eagerly awaiting the next lecture, dedicated to compulsive masturbation. The greatest discovery of the century was simply ignored in favor of a discussion of adolescent masturbation. A whole century has passed since then. We fly into space, but sticky protein still devours the human mind with impunity. For years, the universe's radio silence and the Fermi paradox have rankled the inflated human ego, accustomed to considering itself the center of the universe. We build giant radio telescopes, point them into the cold abyss, and listen to the hiss of the void. Space is silent. The great physicist Enrico Fermi posed his mocking question back in the mid-20th century. If aliens exist, then where are they all hiding? Our galaxy has been around for billions of years. During this colossal time, any advanced civilization, at the speed of a lazy snail, would have colonized every habitable rock. But instead of radio signals or space debris, we hear only the dull hiss of the vacuum. People stubbornly believe in their uniqueness. The average person's psyche cannot stomach the idea that we are merely a fleeting mold on the outskirts of an abandoned star system. In an attempt to justify this cosmic neglect, scientists have come up with the concept of the Great Filter. The idea is simple. An insurmountable barrier stands in the way of the development of intelligent life. Perhaps bacteria are simply physically unable to become multicellular, or technological societies inevitably destroy themselves. All it takes is a couple of ambitious idiots to get their hands on a nuclear button or unleash a crazed artificial intelligence. Other fantasists cling to the zoo hypothesis. Supposedly, super-intelligent humanoids discovered Earth long ago. They observe us from a safe haven like wild monkeys. They deliberately avoid contact. Why would an advanced race communicate with creatures who kill each other over imaginary boundaries on maps? To them, we are just a bunch of savages, swarming in our own filth. And indeed, it's time to acknowledge reality. Humanity has been listening to the sky for a measly 100 years. In the universe's timescale, that's a speck of time. Radio waves from Earth have only reached a tiny percentage of the nearest stars. Space isn't empty. It simply despises our stupidity. The universe's radio silence has become the logical outcome of the development of a civilization that considers itself the pinnacle of creation, yet remains hopelessly stuck in ignorance. The illusory somatosensory response in phantom pain clearly demonstrates that the human brain is a lazy and stupid computer. We are stuck in illusions. We are easily deceived. All it takes is a simple piece of mirror and a cheap cotton swab. You can cut off a person's arm, but their central nervous system will continue to pretend the limb is still there. About 80% of amputees experience these wild phantom sensations for years. The brain remembers everything. It feels the arm itch, cramp, or literally burn like hell in empty space. In the early 1990s, neurobiologist Villayanur Ramachandran decided to investigate this cognitive glitch. He placed strange ads in San Diego newspapers, looking for people with ghosts. A patient named Tom, who had lost his arm, came to him. Ramachandran blindfolded him and used an ordinary cotton swab, no fancy equipment. When the researcher ran a soft cotton swab across the boy's cheek, he suddenly cried out in surprise. He felt a touch on his missing thumb. It was incredibly strange. But the secret is simple. On the surface of our cortex, there is a detailed map of the body, discovered by the Canadian Penfield. In this map, the face area is located right next to the hand area. When a hand is cut off, the corresponding area of the brain becomes empty. Neighboring living facial neurons literally occupy the vacant cortex. They sprout their processes there. As a result, the signal from a touch on the cheek is duplicated in the area of the former palm. The brain gets confused. It gives the illusion of warmth or itching in the severed fingers. Ramachandran went further and created a device for a small fortune. It was a simple wooden box with a mirror in the middle. A patient would insert their healthy arm into one compartment and their stump into the other. Looking into the glass at an angle, the patient would see a reflection of their healthy arm where there was nothing physically there. A complete illusion of integrity. The brain saw the dead arm moving again. This visual illusion instantly broke the vicious cycle of learned paralysis. The pathological spasm subsided. The pain vanished. Phantom torment surrendered to a common trick from the arsenal of street magicians. And this is the best proof of how primitive our perceptual mechanisms are. The temporal asynchrony of the medial temporal lobe that occurs during déjà vu turns millions of adults into terrified mystics every day. You're standing in the middle of the street, drinking cheap coffee, and suddenly realize this scene has happened before. The same words, the same passerby. The average person immediately starts muttering about past lives, parallel universes, or a glitch in the matrix. The human ego prefers to feel like the hero of a science fiction movie than to admit to a simple malfunction in cheap wiring in their head. And yet, up to 90% of the population has experienced this glitch. Documentation of this system of errors began long ago. Around 400 AD, the Christian theologian Augustine of Hippo irritably called it false memory. But the phenomenon's official name was given by the French philosopher Émile Boirac in 1876 in his book On the Future of Mental Science. He called it déjà vu. Since then, physiologists have been digging deep into our brains, trying to understand the cause of this systemic glitch. They quickly pinpointed the source of the problem. All these miracles occur in the medial temporal lobe of the brain, which is responsible for memory encoding and pattern recognition. Sometimes this system simply malfunctions, and it malfunctions for the most basic physiological reasons. The most severe example is a microscopic electrical discharge, similar to a tiny epileptic seizure. Neurons in the temporal lobe suddenly fire an abnormal impulse, and you sense a wild sense of familiarity where none should exist. Another possibility is a simple desynchronization. The brain receives information from the senses through two channels. Normally, they operate in sync. But if one channel delays the signal by a millisecond, the system breaks down. The brain manages to process the first, blurred signal subconsciously, and a moment later, the second signal is perceived consciously. As a result, you experience the same second twice. Or a simple archive mix-up is to blame. Information about the current event is mistakenly written directly to long-term memory instead of the temporary files folder. The brain reads this fresh file, convinced it's retrieved it from a dusty chest of memories. Or sometimes, cryptomnesia is to blame. You once saw a similar image in a movie or read it in a book, but happily forgot the fact. Now the real situation matches that old image, and the brain happily sends a false signal of recognition. In 1941, scientists Bannister and Zangwill set out to prove this primitiveness. They hypnotized volunteers, showed them certain words, and then erased their memories of the session. When the subjects were shown the same words again, their brains instantly stumbled. They experienced classic déjà vu. They felt a vague familiarity, but couldn't recall the source. Our memory isn't a hard drive full of files, but a fragile puzzle that reassembles itself with every attempt to recall. And this puzzle is incredibly easy to break with a simple timing glitch. So the next time you experience déjà vu, don't search for past lives. Just wait for your cognitive processor to reset the frozen clipboard.